Kentucky, 1847. Margaret Cunningham drove the iron spike into the man's skull before he even finished saying grace. He had thanked God for the warm meal. He had thanked the sisters for their kindness. His hands were still folded in prayer when she struck. She wiped the blood from her hands on her apron, walked downstairs, and served a dessert. They called it hospitality. 43 men called it the last night of their lives. Subscribe now and tell me what city you're watching from. There is a particular kind of evil that does not announce itself. It does not arrive wearing darkness or carrying a blade in the open. It arrives warm. It arrives smiling. It arrives with a hot meal set on the table and a soft hand resting on your shoulder, telling you that you are safe now, that you are among friends, that the road behind you was hard, but the night ahead will be kind. That was the Millbrook Inn, and that was the Cunningham sisters. To every man who ever rode that mountain road through the Kentucky wilderness in the early years of the 19th century, the sight of Millbrook Inn appearing through the tree line was nothing short of a miracle. The road itself was punishing, mud and rocks and cold wind that cut through even the heaviest coats. Wolves howling somewhere off in the dark. No towns for miles in any direction, just trees and sky and the hollow sound of your own horse breathing hard beneath you. And then light. Warm yellow light pouring out from windows, the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. The sound of a woman's voice calling out from the porch, telling you to come on up, that there was plenty of room, that you looked like you could use a rest. That voice belonged to Margaret Cunningham, the oldest sister, the one who ran the business, the one who kept the books and made the decisions, and always knew exactly what she was doing. Thomas Kellerman heard that voice for the first time in the winter of 1832. He was 51 years old, a cattle buyer from the lowlands of Virginia, traveling west alone because his wife had died 2 years prior, and there was nothing left back home that held him anymore. He had money in his saddlebag, a good sum, the result of several successful trades, and a tired horse, and no one in the world who was expecting him anywhere in particular. He rode up to the porch, and Margaret Cunningham came down those steps to greet him, like he was a long-lost cousin arriving for supper. "You look frozen half to death," she said, and her voice was the kind of voice that made a man feel 10 years younger, warm and easy and full of genuine concern. "Come inside. I've got stew on the fire, and there's a room at the top of the stairs with a bed that'll feel like heaven after a road like that one." Kellerman climbed down from his horse. "Much obliged," he said. "Wasn't sure I'd find anywhere to stop before dark." "We don't let travelers pass us by," Margaret said, and she smiled. "Not in weather like this." That smile. That was the thing people remembered later, when they tried to make sense of what the Cunningham sisters were. The smile was real. That was the part that haunted everyone who eventually learned the truth. It was not a performance. Margaret Cunningham genuinely enjoyed welcoming people. She genuinely took pleasure in making a man feel comfortable and seen and valued. That warmth was not a mask she put on. It was the knife she used. Inside the inn, Kellerman was introduced to the other 3 sisters. Catherine was the one who caught his attention first, because Catherine caught every man's attention first. She was younger than Margaret by 4 years and had a particular way of sitting across from you at the table and making you feel as though you were the only person in the room worth talking to. She laughed at the right moments and leaned forward at the right moments. And by the time the stew was finished, Thomas Kellerman had told her things about his dead wife that he had never spoken aloud to anyone. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Catherine said quietly. "She was," Kellerman said, his voice cracked slightly. "I miss her every day." "Of course you do," Catherine said. "A man like you doesn't stop loving easily." Sarah, the 3rd sister, came in from the kitchen, carrying a small clay cup of something warm and herbal. She said it in front of Kellerman without being asked. "For the chill," she said. "Mountain herb tea, my grandmother's recipe. It'll help you sleep." Sarah was quieter than the others. Where Margaret commanded and Catherine seduced, Sarah simply watched. She had eyes that took in everything and gave back nothing. She knew plants the way a doctor knows bones. She could tell you what grew on every hillside within 20 miles of that inn, what each root did to the body, what each leaf did to the mind. She had learned from her mother, who had learned from a woman brought to Kentucky from the Carolinas in chains, a woman whose knowledge of herbs and medicines ran so deep and so dark that even the white women who owned her were afraid to cross her. That knowledge lived in Sarah Cunningham now, translated and refined and turned toward purposes her teacher could never have imagined. Elizabeth, the youngest, barely said a word that first evening. She was 19 years old and had the kind of face that made men feel protective. She sat by the fire with a piece of mending in her hands and looked up at Kellerman occasionally with wide, serious eyes, and something about her silence made the whole scene feel even more domestic and safe. Like a family. Like the family Kellerman no longer had. He drank the tea. He went upstairs. He did not come back down. In the morning, Margaret told the stable boy that Mr. Kellerman had left before sunrise, paid in full and grateful. She showed the boy 2 coins as proof. The stable boy, who was 14 years old and had been working at the inn since he was 11, nodded and went back to his work. His name was Elias. He was the property of a man in the next county, on loan to the Cunningham sisters for seasonal work. He had seen things at that inn that he did not understand, and he had learned early that understanding was not something a boy in his position could afford. He fed the horses and kept his eyes down and said nothing. That was 1832. By 1840, Millbrook Inn had become one of the most talked-about stops on the Western Frontier Road. Travelers wrote about it in letters home. Men who had stayed there mentioned it to other men as though sharing a secret treasure. "If you're passing through the Kentucky mountains," they said, "stop at the Cunningham sisters' place. Best meal you'll find for 100 miles. Women treat you like your family." Family. That word came up again and again in those letters and conversations. The sisters made men feel like family. And then those men disappeared. Not all of them, of course. That was the genius of it, if you could call it that. Most men who stopped at Millbrook Inn went on their way without incident. They ate and slept and paid and rode west and lived full lives and never thought of the Cunningham sisters again except to recommend them to a friend. The sisters were not indiscriminate. They were not reckless. They chose carefully, the way a careful hunter chooses, watching the herd and selecting the animal that has wandered furthest from the rest, alone. No family waiting, no associates expecting them in a particular city by a particular date. A man with money, traveling solo, who had let slip over dinner that there was no one back home who would raise an alarm if he was late. That was the profile, and over nearly 2 decades, that profile never changed. What changed was how smooth they became, how practiced, how precise. In the early years, there had been moments of panic, a body too visible, a horse that wandered back to a nearby town without its rider, questions that came a little too close. Margaret had handled those moments with cold clarity, redirecting suspicion toward bandits, toward accidents, toward the general danger of frontier travel. And it worked. Because the world of 1832 was a world in which a lone man disappearing on a mountain road was not remarkable. It happened. The wilderness was unforgiving, and bandits were real, and sometimes men just rode into the dark and were never seen again. But Margaret was smart enough to know that pattern recognition was the enemy. She varied the intervals. She turned away travelers who had come too recently after a disappearance. She cultivated friendships with the local sheriff's office, baking pies for the deputies, lending money at no interest to a struggling farmer who happened to be a county official's brother. She built a reputation for decency and community, layer by careful layer, until the Cunningham sisters were not suspects. They were pillars. Catherine maintained the social connections. She attended church every Sunday and sang in the choir and wept publicly at funerals. She was engaged twice. Both engagements ended mysteriously, the men departing under circumstances that were never fully explained. And both times, the community rallied around her with sympathy. Sarah tended her garden and her animals and rarely left the property. Neighbors thought her strange but harmless. A spinster with a knowledge of herbs. A woman who talked more to her plants than to people. Elizabeth grew up and grew quieter. There was something in Elizabeth's eyes in those later years that was not quite right, people said, though no one could name what it was. A kind of distance, a flatness, as though whatever lived behind those eyes had retreated somewhere a long way back. Elias, the stable boy, had grown into a man. He was still there. He had nowhere else to go. And beneath the floorboards of the Millbrook Inn, beneath the cheerful rugs and the warm firelight and the smell of good cooking, something was accumulating. Year by year, man by man, a record written not in ink, but in silence and in soil, in the dark of the Kentucky mountain caves that opened behind the property, in the cold underground where Thomas Kellerman and 42 others lay still. Their gold was gone. Their horses were sold 3 counties away. Their names were fading from the memory of a world that had never looked very hard for them to begin with. And the sisters smiled and set out another cup of tea and listened to the sound of another horse coming up the road. Elias had a habit of counting things. He counted the nails in the stable wall. He counted the horses that came in and the horses that went out. He counted the men who arrived at Millbrook Inn on cold evenings with money on their belts and hope in their eyes. And he counted the mornings when those same men were gone before sunrise, their horses already sold off quietly, their rooms already stripped and washed and made up fresh for the next guest. He had been counting since 1834. He never wrote the numbers down. Writing was not something Elias was permitted to do, and even if it had been, paper left evidence. But the numbers lived in his head, with a weight and a clarity that nothing could touch. By the winter of 1843, the number was 31. He never said it aloud, not once. He had learned the cost of speaking too early, too loudly, to the wrong person. He had learned it the hard way in the summer of 1836, when a traveling preacher named Josiah Clay had stayed 3 nights at the inn, and on the second night had pulled Elias aside near the water trough and said quietly, "Son, is everything all right here? You've got the look of a man carrying something he shouldn't have to carry alone." Elias had looked at the preacher for a long moment. He had felt something move in his chest, something dangerous and warm, the thing a person feels when they are about to trust someone they probably shouldn't. He opened his mouth. And Margaret Cunningham appeared in the doorway behind the preacher like she had grown out of the wood itself. "Mr. Clay," she called, her voice bright and easy. "Catherine's just pulled your cobbler out of the oven. You'll want to come in before it goes cold." The preacher turned and smiled and went inside. Elias closed his mouth. He went back to feeding the horses. He did not sleep that night. Josiah Clay left the next morning. He was one of the ones who left. Elias never knew why some men left and others didn't. That uncertainty was its own kind of torture. He would watch a man ride away down the mountain road and feel something loosen in his chest, some knot of dread unwinding just slightly. And then the next man would arrive, and the counting would continue. By 1845, Elias had begun to notice something that frightened him in a way that was different from the ordinary fear he had carried for years. Sarah was changing. It was not dramatic. There were no scenes, no outbursts. It was subtler than that. It was the way she stood in the herb garden for long stretches of time without moving, staring at nothing. The way she had begun talking to herself in a low murmur when she thought no one was near. Conversations that were one-sided and circular, and that sometimes, if you listened closely enough, seemed to be directed at men who were no longer alive. One evening in late October, Elias was passing the kitchen window when he heard Sarah's voice inside, clear and conversational. "You should have turned around," she was saying. "I told you the road was going to get worse."
"Didn't I say that? You never listened."
He stopped walking. "Sarah?" he said through the window. She turned and looked at him with those flat, careful eyes. "The stew needs more salt," she said. Then she turned back to the pot and said nothing else. That night Elias lay on his cot in the stable and stared at the dark above him and thought about the number 31 and about what 31 men looked like if you stacked them end to end in a cave. He had seen the cave entrance once by accident years ago. He had never gone near it again. But he knew it was there, behind the stand of sycamore trees at the back of the property, hidden behind a wall of brush that Margaret had told him once was for keeping out mountain cats. He had believed her then. He was 12 years old and had believed almost everything Margaret told him, because Margaret spoke with an authority that did not invite doubt. But he was not 12 anymore. The question that kept him awake was not what the sisters had done. He knew what they had done. The question was what he was, for knowing it and saying nothing. He had no good answer for that. He had only survival, which some nights felt like a reason, and other nights felt like a shame so deep it had no bottom. In the spring of 1846, a man arrived at Millbrook Inn who was different from the others in a way Elias could not immediately name. His name was Samuel Hartwell. He was a cotton broker out of Georgia, traveling north to Pittsburgh on business, well-dressed and confident, with 2 associates who had split off at the last crossroads to take a different route. He planned to meet them in Pittsburgh within the fortnight. Margaret welcomed him the same way she welcomed everyone. Hartwell came inside and sat at the table and ate Catherine's cooking and drank Sarah's tea and watched Elizabeth sew by the fire. He was charming in a practiced, professional way, the kind of man who had spent years in rooms full of strangers and had learned to fill them with easy conversation. "Fine operation you ladies run here," he said over dinner, leaning back in his chair. "I've stopped at half the inns between Savannah and the Ohio River, and I'll say honestly, this is the best table I've found." "That's very kind," Margaret said, smiling. "Not kindness," Hartwell said, "just honesty. I tell things as I see them. Ask anyone who's done business with me." He paused. "My associates are expecting me in Pittsburgh on the 14th. I've got 2 men who will come looking if I'm so much as a day late." He said it pleasantly, conversationally, the way a man mentions the weather. But his eyes moved to Margaret when he said it, and they held there for a moment. Something passed across Margaret's face, fast, gone before anyone else at the table would have noticed. But Elias, who was clearing dishes near the far wall, noticed. He had spent 15 years watching Margaret's face the way a sailor watches the sky. He refilled Hartwell's glass and went back to the kitchen. Later, after the guest had gone upstairs, Elias was near the back hall when he heard the 4 sisters in the small room they used for private conversations. He did not stop walking. He did not press his ear to the door. He did not need to. Margaret's voice carried the way it always did when she was working through a problem. "2 men expecting him in Pittsburgh," Catherine said. "That changes things." "It changes the timeline," Margaret said. "Not the decision." "Margaret!" That was Elizabeth's voice. Quieter than the others, slightly unsteady. "He's not like the others." "They're all like the others." "No," Elizabeth again. "He's not. He said people will come looking." "People say a lot of things," Sarah said, and there was something in her tone that was not quite right, a flatness that did not belong to the conversation, as though she was not entirely present in it. "We wait," Margaret said, and that ended it. That always ended it. Margaret's voice in that particular register was not an invitation to further discussion. Elias went back to the stable and sat down on his cot with his hands between his knees and the number 32 forming somewhere in the back of his mind like a bruise coming up slow. He made a decision that night. It terrified him. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever considered. But he made it anyway, with the kind of clarity that only comes when a person has finally reached the bottom of what they can carry. He was going to find a way to warn Samuel Hartwell. The problem was that he had no access to Hartwell until morning. The man's room was upstairs, and the sisters controlled the upstairs after dark. He would have to wait until Hartwell came down for breakfast and find a moment, a single moment, when none of the sisters were close enough to see. He rehearsed what he would say. He rehearsed it in whispers, sitting in the dark.
Sir, you need to leave this place right now and do not ask me why. Just get on your horse and ride, and tell someone in the next town what this place is called.
Something like that. Quiet, fast, no hesitation. He rehearsed it until he could feel it in his hands, the words already formed and ready. He did not sleep. By the time first light came through the stable walls, Elias was already positioned near the inn's side door with a reason to be there. 2 buckets and a task, and the look of a man doing ordinary work. He waited. He heard movement upstairs. He heard footsteps crossing the floor above him. He heard the creak of the staircase, and then he heard Sarah's voice, already down in the kitchen, already cheerful, already calling up to Hartwell that coffee was on and breakfast was nearly ready, saying, "Come on down, Mr. Hartwell. You've got a long road ahead of you." Elias stood with his 2 buckets and listened to Hartwell's footsteps descend the stairs and enter the kitchen, and the door closed. And that was it. The moment was gone. He stood there for a long time after that. The morning passed. Hartwell ate breakfast. Elias watched through the window as Catherine sat across from him at the table, her chin in her hand, listening to him talk with that expression she wore, the one that made men feel like what they were saying was the most interesting thing anyone had ever said. Hartwell was smiling. He had no idea. And Elias understood then, with a finality that settled into his bones like cold, exactly what his silence had cost 32 men. He understood it not as an abstract guilt, but as a specific physical weight, the kind you cannot put down. He went back to his work. He counted the nails in the stable wall. He started again from 1. Hartwell never made it to Pittsburgh. And in a counting house in that city, 2 men waited by the window for a colleague who would never come through the door. Hartwell's associates waited 14 days before they stopped believing in accidents. The first man, a merchant named Gerald Poole, told himself that Hartwell had probably taken a detour. Then he told himself Hartwell had probably stopped somewhere for business. Then he told himself things that were harder to believe. And by the 15th day, he stopped telling himself anything and went to the county sheriff in Pittsburgh and said, "My partner has not arrived, and I need someone to start asking questions along the road." The sheriff in Pittsburgh was a practical man who had heard stories like this before. Most of them ended with the missing man turning up drunk in a tavern 2 towns over, or having run off with someone's wife, or simply having decided that Pittsburgh was not where he wanted to be anymore. He wrote down Hartwell's name and the general route and said he would make inquiries. The inquiries went south, slowly, the way inquiries did in 1847, through letters carried by riders and passed from one county office to the next, and eventually, like water finding its way through rock, one of those letters reached a small office in Harlan County, Kentucky, where a man named Sheriff Thomas Brennan sat behind a desk that was covered in paper he never had enough time to read. Brennan was 53 years old. He had been sheriff of that county for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had developed a particular instinct for the difference between a case that was what it appeared to be and a case that was something else entirely. He could not have explained the instinct in any scientific way. It was just a pressure, a tightness across the back of his shoulders when something wasn't right. He felt that tightness the moment he read the letter about Samuel Hartwell. Not because Hartwell's disappearance was unusual. Men disappeared on that mountain road with a regularity that no one wanted to examine too closely. No, what tightened Brennan's shoulders was a different thing entirely. It was the fact that he had seen that road on his duty maps for 11 years, and that somewhere in the back of his memory, Millbrook Inn sat at the edge of nearly every disappearance report he had ever processed. Never central, never obvious, just present, the way a shadow is present at the corner of your eye when you are trying to look directly at something else. He pulled his files. It took him the better part of a day, digging through reports that went back to before his tenure, back to the mid-1830s, reports filed by other men in other offices who had each looked at their individual piece of the picture and seen nothing alarming. Brennan spread those pieces out across his desk and looked at the whole. The number he arrived at was not 43, not yet, but it was large enough to make his hands go still on the paper. He rode out to Millbrook Inn on a Tuesday morning in late November 1847, without sending word ahead. He told himself this was standard procedure. He did not fully admit to himself that he was afraid of what might happen to any warning he sent. Margaret Cunningham met him on the porch with coffee and a smile so steady it almost made him doubt himself. Almost.
"Sheriff Brennan,"
she said, like a woman greeting a neighbor. "What a cold morning to be on the road. Come inside." "I'll stay out here, thank you," Brennan said. "I'm making inquiries about a traveler named Samuel Hartwell, cotton broker out of Georgia. We believe he may have passed through sometime in the spring of '46. "Oh." Margaret's face moved through something that looked like gentle concern. "A lot of travelers come through here, Sheriff." "I do my best to remember faces, but it gets difficult after a while." "I'm sure it does," Brennan said. He watched her hands. They were folded in front of her, completely still. He would have been traveling alone, well-dressed, had business in Pittsburgh. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "I truly can't place him. You're welcome to ask my sisters. One of them may remember better than I do." "I'd like that," Brennan said. He talked to all 4 sisters that morning. Catherine performed confusion beautifully. Sarah barely engaged with him at all, answering in monosyllables and looking past his shoulder as though she was tracking something moving in the middle distance. Elizabeth was the one that caught him. She was the last sister he spoke to, and she answered his questions the same way the others had, with polite, careful blankness. But when Brennan stood up to leave and said, almost casually, "If you think of anything at all, I'd appreciate you sending word to my office," Elizabeth looked at him with those flat eyes for just a moment too long. "I'll pray for that man's family," she said. It was a normal thing to say, a kind thing to say. But Brennan had not mentioned that Hartwell had a family. He had described Hartwell as a man with business associates. He had said nothing about family. He rode back toward town slowly, turning that detail over in his mind. He stopped twice on the road to write in the small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. He did not go back to Millbrook Inn that day. He went back to his office and he started writing letters. And this time the letters were not inquiries. They were requests for official records, property records, tax records, purchase records for horses sold at markets in the surrounding counties over the past 15 years. What came back to him over the following 6 weeks was not dramatic. It was not a confession or a smoking gun or any of the things that stories tend to require. It was something quieter and more devastating. It was a pattern so consistent and so long-running that the only explanation for why no one had seen it before was that no one had ever bothered to look. Horse sales, saddles, personal effects turning up at trading posts 50 and 60 miles from Millbrook Inn, sold by intermediaries who could not clearly remember who had brought them in or when. Kellerman's pocket watch had shown up at a pawnbroker in Lexington in 1833. A monogrammed belt buckle belonging to a Virginia merchant named Hargrove appeared in a market stall in 1839. Small things. Individual, they were nothing. Together, they were a trail that led straight back up the mountain. Brennan went back to Millbrook Inn in January 1848 with 2 deputies and a warrant. Margaret answered the door. When she saw the deputies behind Brennan, something happened in her eyes. Not fear, not panic. Something colder than that. The calculation of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time and was now deciding in real time which version of the plan she was going to execute. "Sheriff," she said, "this is unexpected."
"I have a warrant to search the property," Brennan said. "Of course," she said, and stepped back to let them in. They went through the inn first. The rooms were clean and orderly, every surface scrubbed, every corner bare of anything incriminating. Catherine sat at the kitchen table and watched them work with an expression of patient dignity. Sarah stood in the doorway to the back of the house and did not move until one of the deputies asked her to step aside, and then she moved without a word. Elizabeth was not in the inn. Brennan noticed her absence and said nothing. It was one of the deputies, a young man named Willis, who found the cave. Not because he was clever or experienced, but because he walked too far back on the property following a set of tracks in the frost, and pushed through the brush line looking for Elizabeth Cunningham, and found instead an opening in the hillside that was not natural and was not small, and from which came a smell that stopped him where he stood. He came back to the inn at a run. Brennan went to the cave himself. He went in with a lantern and Willis at his shoulder, and he walked until the lantern showed him what was there, and then he stopped walking. He stood in that cave for a long time without speaking. When he came back out, his face was a different color than it had been when he went in. "Get them," he said to Willis. "Get all 4 of them right now." They found 3 sisters in the inn. Margaret had not moved from the front room. Catherine had her coat on and her bag in her hand and was 3 steps from the back door when the second deputy intercepted her. Sarah was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of her own tea in front of her, and when the deputy told her she was under arrest, she looked down at the cup and said quietly, to no one in particular, "I told him the road was going to get worse." Elizabeth they found sitting behind the stable in the frost with her arms around her knees, not trying to run, not crying, just sitting. When Brennan crouched down in front of her and said, "Elizabeth, I need you to come with me," she looked at him with those eyes and said, "How many did you find?" Brennan said, "A lot." "All of them?" she said. He did not answer. "Good," Elizabeth said, and she stood up and walked with him without being touched, without being asked again, walking ahead of him toward the wagon with the steadiness of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Behind the stable, the frost was undisturbed. The horses moved quietly in their stalls, and somewhere in that stable, on a cot he had slept on for 16 years, Elias sat with his hands between his knees and listened to the sound of the Cunningham sisters being taken away. He did not feel relief. He had expected to feel something like relief. What he felt instead was a grief so complicated and so thorough that it had no name he knew. He pressed his hands flat on his thighs and breathed and let the sound of the wagon wheels fade down the mountain road. Then he picked up his coat and walked out of the stable for the last time. He did not look back. The trial of the Cunningham sisters opened in Harlan County on the 3rd of March, 1848, and by the end of the first morning, every seat in the courthouse was filled, and people were standing 3 deep along the back wall and spilling out onto the steps into the cold. Sheriff Brennan had expected interest. He had not expected this. He stood near the front of the room and watched the crowd fill in,
and felt something uneasy move through him, something he could not name until he realized what it was. These people were not here out of civic duty. They were here the way people go to a fire. They wanted to see the thing burn. Margaret Cunningham walked into that courthouse like she was walking into church. Back straight, chin level.
She sat down at the defendant's table and folded her hands in front of her and looked at the judge with the same patient steadiness she had used on every traveler who ever walked through her door.
Catherine came in behind her and kept her eyes down, which the crowd interpreted as shame and which Brennan interpreted as strategy. Sarah moved through the room like she was only partially present in it, her gaze drifting, her lips moving slightly with words no one could hear. Elizabeth was last.
She walked in and sat down and looked immediately at the crowd, scanning faces with a directness that made people shift in their seats. She was looking for something. Brennan watched her eyes move across the room and stop. He followed her gaze to the back wall. Elias was standing there. He had come into town 2 days after the arrest, walking down from the mountain with nothing but his coat and whatever he carried inside him. Brennan had found him sleeping in a livery stable and had brought him in for questioning, not as a suspect, but as a witness, the only witness to 16 years of what happened at Millbrook Inn. The conversation had lasted 4 hours. Brennan had not slept the night after.
Now Elias stood at the back of the courthouse with his arms at his sides and his face completely still, and Elizabeth looked at him across the crowded room, and something passed between them that no one in that courtroom could have described or named. Not forgiveness, not accusation. Something older than both of those things. Then the judge called the court to order, and Elizabeth looked away. The prosecution built its case methodically over 11 days. They brought in the horse sale records. They brought in the pawnbrokers who had handled the personal effects. They brought in Gerald Poole from Pittsburgh, who testified about Samuel Hartwell with a grief so raw and unguarded that several women in the gallery wept openly. They brought in 2 other men who had stayed at Millbrook Inn and survived. Men who described in careful detail the tea that Sarah pressed on every guest, the particular heaviness that came over them after drinking it, the unusual depth of sleep that followed.
One of those men, a farmer named Odell Cross, leaned forward on the witness stand and said, "I woke up in the night and I couldn't move my hands right. Felt like the bones had gone soft. I thought I was dying. By morning I felt fine, but I never went back to that place, and I never told anyone because I thought they'd say I was drunk." He paused. 43 men weren't as lucky as me. The courtroom went so quiet you could hear the wood settling. The defense had very little to work with. Their lawyer was a young man named Archibald Fenn, who had drawn the assignment rather than volunteered for it, and who spent most of the trial looking like a man trying to hold water in his bare hands. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial. He argued that the cave could not be conclusively tied to the defendants. He argued that the pattern of disappearances proved nothing about who was responsible. Margaret sat through these arguments with her hands folded and her face composed, and once, when Fenn made a point about reasonable doubt, she nodded slightly, the way a teacher nods when a slow student finally arrives at the right answer. Brennan watched her from his seat and felt that tightness across his shoulders again. Even here, even now, she was still managing the room. On the 9th day of testimony, Fenn called Elizabeth to the stand. This surprised everyone, including, it seemed, Elizabeth herself. She looked at her lawyer for a moment with something like uncertainty before she stood and walked to the front of the room. Fenn's strategy became clear within the first few questions. Elizabeth was the youngest. Elizabeth had been a child when the killings began. Elizabeth was, in the framing Fenn was building, a person who had been shaped by circumstances beyond her control, born into a family with practices she did not choose and could not escape. "Did you ever participate directly in the death of any traveler?" Fenn asked.
No,
Elizabeth said. "Did you ever strike a guest?
poison a guest or dispose of a body?
No.
Were you ever given the choice to leave Millbrook Inn and live elsewhere? Elizabeth was quiet for a moment.
No,
She said.
I was not.
Fenn nodded with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was building something. And if you had been given that choice, what would you have done? The courtroom waited. Elizabeth's hands were flat on the railing in front of her. She looked at them for a long moment, and then she looked up and found Elias at the back of the room again.
I don't know,
she said. It was the most honest thing anyone said in that entire trial, and it destroyed Fenn's argument more completely than any cross-examination could have. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah were convicted of murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced all 3 to death by hanging. When the verdict was read, Margaret did not move. Catherine pressed her eyes closed for a moment and then opened them again. Sarah turned to look at the window on the east wall and said nothing at all. Elizabeth was convicted as an accessory. The judge, citing her age at the time the killings began and her apparent lack of direct participation, sentenced her to life imprisonment rather than death. When she heard her sentence, she nodded once, the same way you nod when someone confirms something you already knew. As the sisters were being led out of the courtroom, Margaret turned and looked back at the room one final time. Her eyes moved across the crowd without expression, past the weeping women and the grim-faced men and the journalists scribbling in their notebooks. They landed, briefly, on Brennan. He held her gaze. For one moment, something moved across her face, something that was neither remorse nor defiance, but something more complicated and more honest than either. Then she turned and walked through the door and was gone. The hangings took place on a Saturday morning in April. Brennan did not attend.
He had been to enough of them in his life, and he had learned that watching a person die did not provide the thing people went to those events looking for. Whatever that thing was, it was not there. He was sitting in his office when Willis knocked on the door frame and said, "It's done." Brennan looked up from his desk. "All 3? All 3. He nodded. Willis stood there a moment, as though expecting something more, some response that would mark the occasion appropriately. Brennan had nothing to offer. He looked back down at his papers. Elizabeth Cunningham served 41 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary. She was the only one of the 4 sisters who ever spoke publicly about what had happened at Millbrook Inn. In 1871, a journalist named Harriet Morse obtained permission to interview her, and what Elizabeth told her over 3 afternoons became a document that circulated in reform circles for years afterward. She did not apologize in that document. She did not ask for sympathy. She described, in plain and clinical language, what the sisters had done and why and how it had been possible for so long without detection. When Morse asked her what she would want people to know, Elizabeth thought for a long time before answering. "That evil is not always loud," she finally said. "Sometimes it's the warmest thing in the room." She died in the penitentiary in 1889. She was 76 years old. She left behind no property, no correspondence, no personal effects, except a small journal that the prison recorded as containing nothing but numbers. Pages and pages of numbers, written in a small, careful hand. No one ever determined what the numbers represented. Elias walked out of Harlan County the morning after the trial ended. He was 30 years old. The emancipation had not yet come. He was still, legally, the property of a man in the next county, a man who had neither appeared at the trial nor sent any inquiries about the status of his property during the proceedings. Brennan knew this. He had known it through the entire investigation. He had made a choice, quietly and without documentation, not to make an issue of it. He never said this to Elias.
There was no conversation, no formal acknowledgement, no moment of recorded liberation.
Elias simply walked out of town and kept walking, and no one stopped him, and no one followed. And Thomas Brennan sat in his office and wrote in his case file that all relevant witnesses had been accounted for and the matter was closed. Whatever became of Elias after that morning, history did not record. He walked north along the mountain road, past the place where the track forked toward Millbrook Inn, and he did not slow down when he passed it, and he did not look toward the tree line where the cave was. He had spent 16 years counting things he could not change. Whatever he counted from that point forward was his own. Millbrook Inn was dismantled that summer. The materials were sold. The land was purchased by a farmer who planted it with corn and tobacco and told his children nothing about what the soil beneath their feet remembered. The corn grew tall and green and completely ordinary. The cave behind the sycamore trees was sealed with rock and fill. In the years that followed, the case of the Cunningham sisters entered the legal record as a landmark in the regulation of roadside accommodations and traveler safety. New laws were passed. New registries were created. Journalists wrote long pieces about the systemic failures that had allowed 4 women to operate an enterprise of murder for nearly 2 decades in plain sight. What those pieces did not fully address, and what Brennan had written about in a private letter he sent to no one and eventually burned, was the other question. The one that lived underneath all the legal language and the reform rhetoric. The question of how many Eliases there had been. How many people in that world, living at the bottom of every social structure that existed, had seen exactly what was happening and had carried it alone because there was no system, no authority, no mechanism by which their witness would have been received as anything other than a problem to be managed. The 43 graves in the Kentucky mountainside were marked eventually. Small stones, most of them unnamed because the identities of all the victims were never fully established. People came sometimes to stand among those stones and feel whatever it is people feel in places where violence has soaked into the ground. What they were feeling, though they may not have known it, was not just grief for 43 dead men. It was grief for everything the world had been organized not to see. For the boy counting nails in a stable wall. For the number 32 forming in the dark like a bruise. For 16 years of a witness that no one was positioned to receive. The stones stood in the Kentucky mountain air and said nothing, the way stones do. And the road ran past them, the way roads always do, carrying people toward whatever waited for them next.